Hello. This lecture, we will focus on taking a look at a little leadership vignette as a profile of someone who is a good example of a community activist that really comes from a really humble position, but her ideas and her influence becomes towering in cities in the 20th century. This lecture also, in providing this vignette of Jane Jacobs, will also provide some information about city planning and land use and urban development that's relevant for large cities and small cities. And so Jane Jacobs is born in Scranton, Pennsylvania in 1916, and she moves to New York's Greenwich Village in the 1920s. Jane had no formal college education until late in life. She started going to night school. She worked as a copywriter and editor and became an associate at the Architectural Digest. And her work at the Architectural Digest really inspired her to become very involved in urban city life. And her work and her observations of cities, in particular her neighborhood of the Greenwich Village, inspired her to write a book that became a classic in American urbanism, and that's The Death and Life of Great American Cities in 1961. And it was based on her untrained observations of city life in American cities. She served in only really one true leadership position, and that's as the chairperson of the Joint Committee to stop the Lower Manhattan Expressway in 1962. She moved to Toronto in 1968 in protest of the Vietnam War and to avoid having her two sons drafted. But she continued to stay engaged and worked on issues of urban life in Toronto. And she died there in 2006 at the age of 89. Jacobs became an activist in the early 60s, frustrated with the power and unbridled authority of New York City planner Robert Moses, whose work really was the antithesis of her urban observations. And it's part of what inspired her urban observations, because she felt like Moses was destroying vital parts of neighborhoods in and around New York City, and which in effect was killing the city. These expressways really meant that he was designing the city around the automobile. Moses was a powerful force in New York politics and perhaps the most powerful unelected leader in the state, and did some really important and notable infrastructure projects that still exist and are important today. But most notable was the titanic struggle between Moses and Jacobs, which really started over the Lower Manhattan Expressway, which would have decimated Fifth Avenue, which is the center of the island of Manhattan. And it would have cut through the middle of Greenwich Village, isolating two really important parts of the city, Little Italy and Greenwich Village. And of course, he also would have built other transportation infrastructure in and around Washington Square Park, one of the most vibrant and historic neighborhoods of the city. If you've ever gone there, you know what a living park this is. It's one of the best urban public spaces in the world. And Jacobs went to battle to save Washington Square Park and to save Greenwich Village from the destructive force of an expressway you can see in this cartoon, going right through the middle of Manhattan. And so I want to take a look at the different ideas around cities and urban planning that really became what Jane Jacobs, who as an untrained observer, launched attacks against and literally changed the way we think about cities. And so in her opening line of Death and Life, she levies a vicious attack. This book is an attack on current city planning and rebuilding. And she identifies the targets of urban planning, the three models out there: the Garden City, the Radiant City, and the City Beautiful. And these three really form the basis of what was happening in the middle and late 20th century as far as city design. And we're going to take a brief look at those. Ebenezer Howard, who was a bit older, about 50 years prior to Jane Jacobs, had designed this idea to avoid a lot of the grunge of city life, had designed these garden cities, which in effect became the early version of the suburb. And Jacobs was really critical, not so much of the garden cities, but the idea that you're removing park from the vibrancy of the city and you're separating out people based on different uses. And it didn't create the intricate interconnections that you see in city life. Perhaps the most vociferous level of attack was to the French architect, urban planner, and sociologist Le Corbusier. And Le Corbusier, thankfully, his plans for Paris were never ever implemented, because his idea for Paris, if you've been to Paris, you can see one section of the city, which is where the skyscrapers are, La Défense. He had really designed the city to be a bunch of nodes that looked like La Défense, that were essentially large skyscrapers, elevated roadways. The street life would have been decimated. People would have driven their cars into the skyscrapers. There would have been upper decks of parks and green space. And this really is the planning that influenced Robert Moses. It's the radiant city of Le Corbusier in what he wanted New York to be modernized to look like, and encouraged the car culture of commuting in and out of New York. And the highways became the basis of this type of planning for Robert Moses. And this, of course, is what the Moses plan for New York would have ultimately looked like. And you say they look like housing projects. That is exactly what they are. And they are very large, very impersonal, not designed to the human scale, but designed to the car scale. And of course, where you do see this concept implemented is in housing projects, in public housing. And of course, many of those, as we'll talk about in a moment, became disastrous. And the third model is the City Beautiful. And this City Beautiful movement is really a highly programmed and theme parkish kind of city design. Daniel Burnham did this after the Chicago fire around the World's Fair, and created these very grand architectural and almost theme park kind of models with museums and activities. Washington, D.C. and the mall is also sort of to this model. And again, the scale is larger than human. And so it's something that did get away from the intricate kind of interactions. And so they're very different models: the garden suburbs, the modernist skylines, and the theme park downtowns of each, but each really do influence some of 20th century planning for the city, from suburbia to the large modernist city centers that became occupied by day and emptied out by night with skylines, to the design of downtowns that are more oriented toward tourism and theme park kind of activities. And so Jacobs disliked the traditional urban density and diversity, she criticized them because they disliked the traditional urban density and diversity, which she thought was hugely important. And most of these models desired to sort of sort out functions and separate out people. And you see this with the transfer of park and town out of city living, and in a situation that led to more and more separation, as you saw with suburban development. And these folks were well-intentioned, but Jacobs called them to task. And of course, in her book, she argues that it's really the sidewalks that are the fulcrums of city life. They are the best deterrents against crime. A busy sidewalk used day and night by different populations on their way to work, home, leisure, checks crime. And so this idea of the eyes upon the street, this idea that there is trust that's built with these interactions that are some cases happenstance interactions on sidewalks creates a high level of trust in social capital. The housing projects that you see here in Chicago are really good example of Le Corbusier's design model of the radiant city. But these projects really turned that street life inward into courtyards away from streets and sidewalks, and the eyes on the street no longer were there. And so there wasn't any commerce or street life to keep them active all hours of the day and the night. And because there wasn't sidewalks, there became this issue of turf. There became this issue of it's mine, not ours. And so because there weren't really vibrant public spaces and vibrant interactive options, you begin to see the defense of this turf with gang warfare, and on the other end of the spectrum, the wealthy fortressing themselves in gated communities. And so to Jacobs, it was all about the sidewalk and all about this intricate ballet that takes place in the sidewalk, as the quote here is one of the most quoted from her book, A Complex Order. Its essence is intricacy of sidewalk use, bringing it to a constant succession of eyes. The order is all composed of movement and change, and although it is life, not art, we may fancifully call it the art form of the city and liken it to a dance. As far as the park is concerned, Jacobs believed that the parks that were the most vibrant and most important were the ones that were in the center of the city, that were surrounded by all these different mix of uses, not separated out somewhere. Rittenhouse Square, which is pictured here in Philadelphia, is a good example of the diverse rim of a neighborhood and a mixture of uses and buildings directly producing for the park this mixture that kept it alive at all different times of the day. And so this intricate sequence of uses and users is really key. And you can see the same thing, for example, in a city like Bowling Green with the center park in the center of downtown. And so Death and Life, really to summarize it there, in her estimation, needs to be a clear demarcation between public and private spaces. There must be eyes on the street belonging to those we might call the natural proprietors of the street, and the sidewalk should have uses on it fairly continuously. And so it's that mix of uses, day and night, different kinds of people. So the diversity became really important part of the city, which is done by having mixed uses. It's done by having uses on the ground floor that might be restaurants and shops, and on the upper floors that might be residential settings and offices. And so small blocks that are designed around human walking, maintaining old buildings and old architecture, and density. Density is important, not this sort of prefabbed common, everything looks the same without really having that type of option for interaction. And so New York post Moses and Jane Jacobs, if you look at what happens in New York, the aftermath of Moses's bold automobile-centered planning regime fell into decline, losing about 10% of the population really in the period that we're talking about. And so by the 90s, really that's when, and it's often the case that somebody might advance something, but it might take 10 or 20 years for it to take hold. By the 90s, many of Jane Jacobs' ideas of a more human scale city with active street life began to be accepted and implemented. And, you know, Owensboro, Kentucky, we used one of those models to develop and redevelop the downtown around many of the ideas of Jane Jacobs. The same thing is the case that we will talk about through the course that we are looking at, particularly in Bowling Green. So really the lesson from her life is that leadership and activism do not require positions of power, authority. They don't require an elite education or a specialization in many cases. She really lays out a vision with sound ideas, with her writing, her study, and her passion for cities, and then challenged the process. If you look at the leadership challenge, she challenged the process of the accepted approach in urban planning in her day, and now her ideas are the most prominent. And in fact, the new urbanism, which came to fruition really at the turn of the century, became the basis for the way a lot of cities and developments are being planned. And you can see this urban design movement is really changing the nature as these designs are looking more at a more urban, compact develop rather than a conventional suburban development. You can see the land use here is much more compact and tight, but everything that is in this suburban oriented development on the top is located here. The traditional, rather than having the big box retail type of situation or the shopping center, you have a main street. And rather than having these suburban oriented housing opportunities and school, you have these networked streets on blocks that are still a neighborhood, but these folks have the opportunity. And so if you just imagine using this model, a person that lives here and how this person might get to school if the school is over here. And this person actually has a safe way by bike or by pedestrian mode to get to school. But if you're looking at somebody who lives here, the only way that this person can get to the primary or the secondary school would be to cross a very busy collector road, or in some cases, if this person wanted to go to the big box retail, the same thing would be the case. So they would have to have a car to survive in this model. Plus, it takes a whole lot of land. And so these ideas are really based on a time-tested pattern of development that really existed prior to the middle of the 20th century. This was the way all cities were designed. And so, you know, these place-based assets really are what make communities attractive to people and inviting. And the visual character, the amenities, they're essential to really the long-term economic vitality. Small towns that are designed this way have a level of authenticity and distinctiveness of place that differentiate them from every town USA, which is unfortunately what a lot of small towns are turning into. So you look at these pictures and say, where would you rather live? Would you rather live, and I don't mean that you have to want to live on the top floor here. You just assume in a traditional neighborhood development that there is a lower density neighborhood just around the corner that you could walk to. But would you rather live in a car oriented or one that shares the use between the bike, the pedestrian, and the automobile? The same thing can be said here and here as well.